The flash lit the horizon before the boom. In a second, the turret of the Panzer IV exploded in a column of fire and twisted metal. "Firefly!" shouted a young German soldier as he dove into the mud of the trench. This would not be just another day on the Western Front. The year was 1944, and Britain's Sherman Firefly tanks were transforming not only the physical battlefield of Europe, but also the psychological landscape of the war. To understand the profound psychic impact these machines exerted on German troops, we need to delve into what Carl Jung would call the collective unconscious of the Wehrmacht soldiers. The German army had built its identity on the myth of technological superiority and invulnerability. Their war machines, particularly the Panzer and Tiger tanks, were considered indestructible by many of the young men operating them. As Jung teaches us in Man and His Symbols, when an individual, or in this case an entire army, excessively identifies with an archetype of power, a dangerous psychic inflation is created. The ego expands, arrogance flourishes, and a distorted sense of invulnerability takes hold. Lieutenant Klaus Himmelmann, a tank commander with the 12th SS Panzer Division, wrote in his diary in June 1944, "Our Tigers are mobile fortresses. The Tommies and their tin can Shermans are like beetles trying to attack rhinos." 3 weeks later, Himmelmann recorded a completely different experience. "I saw 3 Tigers destroyed in less than 5 minutes, something impossible. They say they are new tanks with bigger guns. The men are calling them death fireflies." What happened in those 3 weeks transformed not only the tactical war, but also the psychological war. The Sherman Firefly, with its British 17-pounder gun, could penetrate the frontal armor of the formidable Tiger I at normal combat ranges. Suddenly, the aura of invincibility that protected not only German tanks, but the psyche of their operators was brutally shattered. To grasp the true dimension of this impact, we must understand that a tank is not merely a vehicle of war, it is a symbol. For the soldier who operates it, it represents protection, power, and an extension of the self. Jung would speak of the tank as a material manifestation of the warrior archetype, a physical externalization of the military persona. When this symbolic protection proves fallible, the shock goes far beyond the tactical. It becomes existential. Statistics from the time show that after the first encounters with Sherman Fireflies, surrender rates among German tank crews increased by 34%. It wasn't just the physical fear of death, it was the psychological terror of facing something for which they were unprepared, neither tactically nor psychically. The German High Command quickly realized the physical and psychological danger the Fireflies represented. In July 1944, an extraordinary order was issued to panzer divisions. The new British tanks with long guns must be priority targets. Destroy them before their guns can fire. This order revealed an instinctive understanding of the psychological impact these machines were having. It wasn't just a matter of superior armament, it was a battle for the soul of the German armored troops. German intelligence reports began referring to the Sherman Firefly as flak panzers, anti-aircraft tanks, due to the appearance of its long gun. But among ordinary soldiers, the name Firefly quickly caught on, not just as a translation of the British name, but for the unconscious symbolism it carried. In Jungian psychology, light that suddenly appears in darkness often represents a traumatic revelation, an insight that illuminates aspects of reality we preferred to keep in the shadows. Soldier Wilhelm Schmidt, a survivor of an encounter with Sherman Fireflies during Operation Goodwood, reported in a post-war interview, "Before the Firefly, we felt we were in invulnerable steel boxes. After them, we felt like we were in metal coffins." This account perfectly illustrates what Jung would call enantiodromia, the transformation of something into its opposite. The tank, which was once a symbol of protection and power, transformed into a symbol of entrapment and vulnerability. The military persona built around technological superiority suffered a forced and traumatic dissolution. The impact on German soldiers was not limited to combat moments. Reports from military doctors of the time documented a significant increase in sleep disturbances and nightmares among tank crews after their first encounters with the Sherman Firefly. A doctor from the 9th Panzer Division wrote, "The men report recurring dreams of being hunted by bright lights. Many refuse to sleep inside their tanks when resting, preferring the open ground, even in the rain." Jung teaches us that dreams often process psychic material that consciousness cannot integrate. The primordial terror of being hunted by lights in these soldiers' dreams represents the unconscious's attempt to assimilate a new and terrifying reality, that their mobile fortresses had become vulnerable targets. Letters sent home by soldiers from the front after the first encounters with the Firefly reveal a subtle but profound transformation in language. Later analyses noted a decrease in the use of words associated with power and victory, and an increase in the use of terms related to fate and luck. As Sergeant Hans Weber wrote to his wife, "Before, we made our own luck with our powerful tanks. Now, we pray that luck is on our side and that we don't encounter those deadly fireflies." This linguistic shift reflects a profound alteration in the relationship with the warrior archetype. No longer identified with absolute power, the soldiers began to recognize their own vulnerability, a necessary step in the Jungian individuation process, but terribly traumatic when forced by the circumstances of war. Colonel Otto Schneider, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer, wrote in a confidential report in August 1944, "The impact of the new British tanks on the morale of our armored troops goes beyond the purely military. We are witnessing a crisis of confidence that strikes at the very core of our Panzer Force's identity." What Schneider was describing, in Jungian terms, was a forced dissolution of the collective persona of the German armored forces. The persona, this social mask that Jung describes as our interface with the external world, had been built on the foundation of technological superiority. When this foundation was destroyed by the Firefly's guns, the collective persona disintegrated, leaving the soldiers in a state of psychic confusion. Reactions to this crisis varied. Some commanders tried to maintain the illusion of superiority, insisting that the Sherman Fireflies were anomalies or overstated threats. This denial represents a classic defense mechanism against the integration of the shadow, those aspects of reality that contradict our idealized self-image. Others, like General Heinz Guderian, attempted a more integrative approach, urging technological updates and tactical adaptations. In a meeting with Hitler in September 1944, Guderian reportedly said, "Our men do not fear the enemy, but they fear helplessness. We must give them the means to fight on equal terms." This response represents a more mature attempt to integrate the newly revealed reality. In Jungian terms, it would be the beginning of the true individuation process, the recognition of the shadow, vulnerability, and the attempt to constructively integrate it into collective consciousness. A particularly interesting phenomenon occurred on the battlefields of Normandy after the introduction of the Sherman Firefly. German tank crews began to develop what military psychologists of the time called Firefly vision, an almost paranoid tendency to identify any Sherman as a potential Firefly. Since the British disguised the extra length of the Firefly's gun with camouflage paint, this identification was often erroneous, leading to tactical decisions based more on fear than reality. This phenomenon perfectly illustrates the Jungian concept of psychological projection. The internal fear materializes in a distorted perception of external reality. The threat of the Firefly had become so powerful in the collective psyche of the German troops that its presence was seen, even where it didn't exist.
What are your thoughts on this phenomenon of psychological projection in extreme danger? Have you ever experienced anything similar? The narratives of German survivors who faced the Sherman Firefly often contain elements that Jung would recognize as symbolic. A radio operator from the 2nd Panzer Division described, "When the first Firefly shell hit our tank without penetrating it, the sound was not like the usual metallic impact. It was like a bell, a clear sound that resonated throughout the vehicle, as if it were announcing that our time had come." The image of the bell, an archetypal symbol of announcement and transition, reveals how the psyche processes traumatic experiences through symbolic metaphors. The bell was not literally present. It was how this soldier's unconscious processed the moment when the illusion of invulnerability began to crumble. We cannot fully understand the impact of the Sherman Firefly on German troops without considering the broader context of the war in 1944. After almost 5 years of conflict, Germany was in strategic retreat on all fronts. The emergence of these new Allied tanks capable of neutralizing their armored advantage represented not only a tactical threat, but the materialization of a deeper fear that already inhabited the German collective unconscious: the fear of inevitable defeat.
The evolution of armored warfare until 1944 had created a particular mythology in the minds of German combatants. The emergence of the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks in 1942 and 1943 had established a psychological hierarchy on the battlefield. German tanks reigned supreme, while American Sherman models were disparagingly called lighters or Tommy cookers due to their tendency to catch fire when hit. This technical narrative had transformed into a psychic narrative, a story German soldiers told themselves about their own invulnerability. Lieutenant Kurt Wolfarth of the 1st SS Panzer Division wrote in his memoirs, "Before the Firefly, facing Shermans was almost a sport for us. Their shells bounced off our frontal armor like small pebbles. We laughed inside our Tigers as we destroyed them one after another." This technological arrogance had transformed into psychological hubris, what Jung would call a dangerous inflation of the collective ego. When the first Sherman Fireflies appeared in the fields of Normandy in June 1944, this narrative began to crumble. What we witness in historical documents is the collective equivalent of what Jung would call a persona collapse. The social mask they had built for themselves could no longer be sustained in the face of the new reality. A Tiger gunner, survivor of the Battle of Villers-Bocage, reported, "The first sign that something had changed was when we saw Commander Whitman's Tiger in flames. That was unthinkable. Whitman was an ace, almost a mythological figure to us, and his Tiger seemed invincible. But there it was, pierced and burning, hit from over 800 meters away by something that looked like a common Sherman at first glance." What the soldier was describing was more than a tactical surprise. It was a cognitive rupture. Michael Whitman, one of the greatest German tank aces, embodied the archetype of the invincible warrior hero. His death in combat against Firefly tanks in August 1944 dealt a powerful symbolic blow to the morale of German armored troops. It wasn't just a commander who had fallen. It was a part of their collective mythology that had been destroyed. Radio intercepts by the British reveal a dramatic shift in communication between German tanks after the first encounters with the Firefly. Previously, communications were dominated by offensive and aggressive terms. Afterward, words related to caution, vigilance, and withdrawal became more frequent. A study conducted by the British Army's Psychological Department in 1945 concluded that German crews went from predators to prey in a matter of weeks after the Firefly's introduction. This psychological role reversal is precisely what Jung would describe as a constellation of opposing archetypes. The hunter archetype, previously dominant in the German collective psyche, was suddenly replaced by the prey archetype. This forced and traumatic transition produced profound cognitive dissonance.
Curiously, German medical reports from the time documented an increase in cases of hysterical blindness among tank crews, a psychosomatic phenomenon where soldiers temporarily lost their vision without any apparent physical cause. Jung would interpret this as a somatic manifestation of the psychic refusal to see an intolerable reality, the physical equivalent of psychological denial. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a doctor with the 501st Heavy Tank Battalion, wrote in his clinical records, "Cases of temporary visual disturbances have increased significantly. Patients often report that they couldn't see the enemy tank before it fired, even when other crew members had clearly identified it. I believe we are dealing with a psychosomatic phenomenon related to extreme fear." As 1944 progressed, German tactics changed dramatically in response to the Firefly threat. Tank commanders began to avoid frontal engagements, preferring ambushes and flank attacks. While this could be interpreted as simple tactical adaptation, personal records of officers reveal a deep psychological dimension to this change. Major Hans Leichner wrote in his diary in September 1944, "Our men no longer exhibit the same offensive spirit. They prefer to wait, hide, attack only when they are absolutely certain of an advantage. The German tank, once a symbol of blitzkrieg and aggression, has become defensive. It's as if something fundamental has been broken in the spirit of our armored forces." Jung would teach us that this change represents an archetypal transformation in the collective unconscious of those soldiers. The archetype of the offensive warrior, intimately linked to German military identity since the Lightning campaigns of 1939-1941, was being replaced by the archetype of the defensive warrior, a painful and disorienting transformation for men trained in the tradition of decisive offense. Historically, we know that the Germans quickly developed countermeasures to face the Firefly. The most notable was the order to prioritize any long-barreled Sherman sighted on the battlefield. This tactical adaptation reveals an instinctive recognition of the symbolic power of these tanks. They represented more than a physical threat. They were a psychological threat that needed to be quickly eliminated. A German prisoner captured in Normandy told British interrogators, "We have orders to shoot Shermans with long guns first, even if there are closer or more dangerous targets. Our commanders say that each Firefly destroyed is worth 3 normal Shermans." This prioritization was not just military strategy. It was an attempt to restore psychic balance, eliminating the most potent symbols of the new enemy power. In Jungian terms, it was an attempt to exorcise the demon that had penetrated their collective psyche. The impact of the Sherman Firefly was amplified by a phenomenon Jung would call synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence of external events with internal psychic states. The Fireflies emerged precisely as German confidence began to crumble on all fronts. Operation Bagration in the east had destroyed the Soviet Army Group center. Italy was being lost, and Allied bombings intensified over Germany. The Firefly thus became not just a tank, but a synchronistic symbol of impending collapse. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other videos on Jungian psychology applied to historical events like this. A particularly interesting phenomenon was observed in Tiger and Panther crews who survived encounters with the Firefly. Psychological reports document what was called Firefly psychosis, a tendency to see potential threats in ordinary situations even after returning to Germany. Veterans reported extreme jumps when seeing car headlights at night or camera flashes, any intense light that resembled the distinctive muzzle flash of the Firefly's gun. Dr. Klaus Berger, a military psychiatrist, documented, "Many veterans of panzer units develop an extreme sensitivity to sudden luminous stimuli. A patient recently fainted during a thunderstorm when lightning lit up his room. Upon waking, he was convinced he had been hit by a tank shell." This phenomenon perfectly illustrates the Jungian concept of an autonomous complex, a constellation of traumatic memories and emotional associations that takes on a life of its own in the unconscious, influencing perception and behavior even years after the original event.
Beyond the impact on tank crews, the Firefly had a ripple effect on German infantry. Soldiers who had previously relied on the support of powerful panzers and tigers began to develop what reports called helplessness anxiety. A military doctor described, "The infantrymen now fear that their tanks will be easily destroyed, leaving them vulnerable. Some refuse to advance even with armored support, fearing it might suddenly disappear." This anxiety reflects what Jung would describe as the collapse of a parental projection. German tanks had psychologically functioned as protective parental figures for the infantry. When these figures proved vulnerable, a deep sense of infantile helplessness emerged. A rarely discussed but psychologically significant aspect was the modification the Germans made to their own tanks in response to the Firefly. They added extra armor plates, often improvised, to their panzers and tigers, a measure of dubious effectiveness that often hampered mobility. Jung would interpret this as a symbolic attempt to restore the psychic armor that had been penetrated by trauma. Sergeant Wilhelm Krauss wrote in a letter, "We welded extra metal plates to our Tiger. We all know they won't make much difference against the new British guns, but somehow it makes us feel a little safer. It's like a protective charm." This comparison to a charm reveals the magical symbolic dimension of this adaptation. It was not just a technical modification, but a psychological ritual, an attempt to rebuild the sense of security through symbolic actions. As the war progressed to its final stage, reports of desertions and voluntary surrenders among German tank crews increased significantly. Allied interrogation documents reveal a consistent pattern in the justifications given by prisoners. Many specifically mentioned the Firefly as a decisive factor in their decision to surrender. A prisoner, formerly a Panther commander, stated, "When we heard we would be facing a Firefly-equipped unit, half my crew suddenly fell ill. Stomach pains, fevers, tremors. They weren't cowards, they had fought bravely for years, but something had changed inside them." This account illustrates what Jung would call a rebellion of the unconscious. When the psyche can no longer sustain a conscious attitude, in this case the persona of the fearless soldier, the body often speaks through psychosomatic symptoms.
One of the most revealing documents about the psychological impact of the Firefly is a confidential memorandum from the German High Command dated October 1944, which warned against excessive mention of these tanks in official reports. References to the British tanks with long guns must be limited to the necessary minimum. Excessive emphasis on this threat has contributed to a decline in the morale of panzer units. This document reveals an instinctive understanding of the symbolic and psychological power the Fireflies had acquired. They were no longer just physical vehicles, but psychic entities whose mere name had the power to affect morale. To fully understand this phenomenon, we must consider the German cultural context of the time. Nazi propaganda had built a narrative of Aryan technological superiority as a manifestation of racial superiority. German tanks were presented not just as superior machines, but as proof of German intellectual and cultural supremacy. When the Fireflies began to easily destroy these symbols of supremacy, the blow was both psychological and ideological. The decisive turning point in the collective psyche of German troops occurred during Operation Goodwood in July 1944. This British offensive, involving over 1,100 tanks, included a significant number of Sherman Fireflies. In just 3 days, over 400 German tanks were destroyed or damaged, a devastating blow not only to military capability, but to the psychological identity of the Panzer forces. A radio operator from the 21st Panzer Division captured the exact moment of this transformation in his diary. July 19, 1944. "This morning we witnessed something I will never forget. Our Tigers were positioned on the ridge, as we always did, dominating the terrain. The British Shermans advanced in formation. Normally, this would be the time for the harvest. Our gunners were already calculating how many tin cans they would knock out.
Then we saw the flashes. Not the normal flashes of 75mm cannons, but something different, more intense. In 2 minutes, 3 of our Tigers were burning. I saw men who had fought in Russia, in Africa, men who never showed fear, running in panic, abandoning their still operational tanks. Something fundamental changed today. We are no longer the predators. This account describes what Jung would call a numinous moment, an encounter with archetypal forces so powerful that they permanently transform consciousness.
The sudden reversal of roles, from predator to prey, represents an enantiodromia, the transformation of something into its opposite when pushed to the extreme. Military statistics confirm this transformation. Before the introduction of the Firefly, a Tiger or Panther crew typically remained with the same tank until it was destroyed or severely damaged, an average period of 4.5 months. After July 1944, this period dropped to 5.8 weeks. German officers reported increasing difficulty in maintaining full crews, with a 68% increase in requests for transfers to other units. The deepest psychological phenomenon, however, manifested in what was termed compulsive recognition syndrome, an obsession among German crews with identifying Fireflies among formations of common Shermans. Considering that only about 20% of Shermans were Fireflies, this obsession often led to significant tactical errors. A German commander observed, "My men become so fixated on locating Fireflies that they often ignore more immediate threats. I saw a tank commander allow a common Sherman to approach within 200 meters of his flank because he was focused on a possible Firefly 800 meters away." Jung would interpret this behavior as a manifestation of archetypal fixation, when an archetypal content, in this case the monster that can annihilate, becomes so powerful in the unconscious that it distorts conscious perception and behavior. Curiously, the British soon realized this psychological effect and deliberately exploited it. They began to camouflage the long barrels of their Fireflies with disruptive paint schemes, creating the illusion that the gun was shorter. Simultaneously, they occasionally painted false long guns on common Shermans. This strategy of deception multiplied the psychological effect, making the Germans see Firefly ghosts where none existed. A German prisoner reported, "We were never sure which Sherman could destroy us. We tried to identify Fireflies by their longer gun, but the British started using paint tricks. In the end, we treated any Sherman as a potential Firefly, which meant we felt threatened from all directions." This state of constant hypervigilance produced what German military psychologists called threat fatigue, a chronic state of stress that eventually led to mental and physical exhaustion. Medical reports document a significant increase in cases of nervous breakdown among tank crews in the second half of 1944. Dr. Franz Weber, a doctor with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, wrote, "The symptoms I observe now are different from normal cases of combat fatigue. The men demonstrate not just exhaustion, but a peculiar state of fatalistic resignation. Many express the conviction that their death is inevitable, not as a statistical possibility of war, but as a personal certainty." This psychological state reflects what Jung would call the constellation of the death archetype, when the psyche begins to actively process the possibility of its own finitude. The crucial difference is that before the Firefly, death was seen as an abstract possibility. Afterward, it became a constant and personalized presence. A particularly revealing document was found among the belongings of a tank commander killed during the Battle of Falaise. It was an unsent letter to his wife. "My dearest Helga, before I fought for the Führer, for Germany, for grand ideals. Now I fight only to survive another day. Before I dreamed of victory. Now I only dream of returning home. Something changed inside me when I saw what the new English tanks can do to our invincible Tigers. It's as if I woke from a long dream to find a nightmare waiting."
This letter perfectly illustrates what Jung would describe as the collapse of an identification with the hero archetype and the consequent confrontation with reality stripped of idealized projections, a painful but necessary step in the individuation process. A particularly profound aspect of the Firefly's psychological impact was its effect on the quasi-superstitious beliefs that had developed among German tank crews. Before 1944, many German tankers adopted personal rituals they believed conferred protection. Specific amulets, prayers, or pre-combat routines that supposedly guaranteed their survival. Lieutenant Erich Hoffmann wrote, "Before each battle, the entire crew touched the small iron eagle welded to the inside of our Tiger's turret. It was our protection ritual, and it worked for 2 years in Russia. After our first encounter with a Firefly, where we were almost destroyed, the eagle fell off during the violent concussion. None of us mentioned the incident, but we all felt the same. Our talisman had failed, just like our technology." This account illustrates the dissolution of what Jung would call magical thinking, a psychic regression common in situations of extreme danger, where symbolic rituals serve as coping mechanisms.
When these fail simultaneously with the failure of physical technology, a double collapse of protection systems occurs, both material and psychological. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and if you have an interest in military history or Jungian psychology. A fascinating collective phenomenon emerged in the Panzer battalions in the form of rumors that spread rapidly after the first encounters with the Firefly. One of these rumors held that the British had developed a special type of ammunition that sought the heat of German tank engines. Another claimed that Firefly gunners possessed some type of technologically enhanced vision that allowed them to see through camouflage. These rumors, though technically unfounded, reflect what Jung would call the projection of shadow content, the psyche's tendency to project almost supernatural qualities onto something that defies its understanding. It's significant that these projections often involved enhanced sensory capabilities, as if the Germans were processing the fact that their own perception of reality had been fundamentally inadequate. Radio communications intercepted by the British during this period reveal another significant change in the language used by German crews. The code Achtung Tiger, Attention Tiger, had traditionally been used to warn of the approach of heavy British Churchill or American Pershing tanks. After the introduction of the Firefly, a new code emerged, Achtung Glühwürmchen, Attention Firefly. Notably, this alert received maximum priority in communications, even surpassing warnings about air attacks. This linguistic prioritization reveals the depth to which the Firefly had penetrated the psychic hierarchy of threats. In Jungian terms, language often reveals unconscious archetypal constellations, and the spontaneous emergence of this new code indicates that a new archetype of threat had crystallized in the collective unconscious of the Panzer forces. A particularly intriguing phenomenon was the emergence of what German military psychiatrists called specific pursuit dreams among veterans of Firefly encounters. Unlike normal combat nightmares, these dreams presented a consistent pattern. The dreamer found themselves in confined spaces, pursued by a bright light that penetrated all barriers. Dr. Heinrich Müller documented, "Patient after patient reports variations of the same dream. They are in bunkers, houses, even inside mountains. But the penetrating light always finds them. They often wake up the moment the light finally reaches them, screaming, 'Firefly!'" Jung would interpret these dreams as attempts by the unconscious to process a trauma that consciousness could not integrate. The sudden revelation of one's own vulnerability. The penetrating light symbolizes the traumatic revelation that dissolved the illusion of invulnerability. The physical manifestations of this psychological trauma were documented in medical reports of the time. Among tank crews exposed to combat with Fireflies, doctors noted a 43% increase in gastrointestinal disorders, a 76% increase in chronic insomnia,
and a peculiar phenomenon described as an exaggerated startle reflex, a disproportionate reaction to sudden sounds, particularly those resembling the distinctive firing of the 17-pounder gun. In modern neuropsychological terms, we would recognize these symptoms as manifestations of post-traumatic stress disorder. From a Jungian perspective, they represent the somatization of an unresolved psychic conflict, the body expressing what the mind cannot consciously process. As the war approached its end, a final transformation occurred in the collective psyche of German tank crews. Interrogation reports of prisoners captured in the final months of combat reveal a significant shift in how they described their experience. Many spoke of a strange sense of relief upon being captured or having their tanks destroyed while surviving. A sergeant captured in March 1945 told British interrogators, "When our Panther was hit by a Firefly and I realized I would survive, I felt something I didn't expect. Relief. Not just for being alive, but because the waiting was over. We lived each day expecting the moment we would encounter one of those long guns. Now that it's happened, part of me is at peace, even as a prisoner." This paradoxical reaction illustrates what Jung would call liberation through collapse. When an unsustainable psychic structure finally crumbles, there is often an unexpected feeling of liberation, even in objectively negative circumstances. As the fall of 1944 gave way to winter, the impact of the Sherman Firefly on the German psyche evolved into an even more complex phase. German commanders realized they could not numerically compete with Allied tank production. For every Panther or Tiger destroyed, dozens of Shermans, including the feared Fireflies, arrived at the front.
This unforgiving mathematical reality added another layer to the psychological trauma, the feeling of facing an infinitely renewable enemy while their own resources dwindled. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of German Armored Forces, wrote in a memo to the High Command in November 1944, "Our tank crews now fight not only against an enemy technologically capable of destroying them, but against the perception that this enemy is inexhaustible. This psychological factor is undermining our combat effectiveness more effectively than any technical disadvantage." What Guderian was describing, in Jungian terms, was the constellation of the supernatural enemy archetype, a force that not only threatens but seems to operate beyond normal limitations. In ancient mythologies, this archetype often appears as adversaries who regenerate on multiply, like the Lernaean Hydra that grows 2 heads for each one cut off. The Sherman Firefly had become the modern manifestation of this ancient mythological motif. A notable psychological response to this reality was the development of what German military reports called last stand behavior, a tendency among veteran tank commanders to take extreme, almost suicidal risks in their final engagements before rotation or leave. An assessment report from the 116th Panzer Division noted, "We observe a disturbing tendency among experienced tank commanders. After surviving several engagements, often in their last combat before scheduled leave, they exhibit inexplicably aggressive and reckless behavior, almost as if seeking the destruction they had so long avoided." Jung would interpret this behavior as a manifestation of the attraction to the abyss, when the psyche, after long exposure to extreme fear, develops a paradoxical fascination with the object of its terror. It's the same dynamic that leads people with a fear of heights to feel a disturbing urge to jump when in high places, what modern psychologists call the high place phenomenon. The impact of the Firefly also manifested in soldiers' personal communications. Analyses of letters sent by tank crews to their families reveal a significant change in content and tone after July 1944. In earlier letters, combat descriptions often included technical details about engagements, firing distances, and the relative merits of different tanks. After the first encounters with the Firefly, these technical descriptions virtually disappeared,
replaced by broader reflections on fate, luck, and mortality. A Panther commander wrote to his father in September 1944, It no longer makes sense to discuss technical aspects. The new British tanks show us how futile such discussions are. In the end, it doesn't matter the thickness of the armor or the penetration power. It only matters whether you are seen first or not. Tank warfare has become a game of hide and seek with death. This change reflects what Jung would call the transition from thinking consciousness to feeling consciousness, when technical and analytical aspects give way to deeper considerations of value and meaning. It is a transformation often catalyzed by traumatic encounters with one's own mortality. A fascinating phenomenon emerged in German tank battalions during this period: the development of new forms of nonverbal communication among crews. Observers noted that, in areas where the Firefly was active, German crews developed elaborate systems of hand signals, ground markings, and light codes to communicate the possible presence of these tanks without using the radio, which could be intercepted. A British intelligence officer reported, "German prisoners describe an almost tribal communication system they developed specifically to warn of fireflies. It's remarkable how the presence of our 17-pounder equipped tanks altered even the basic communication methods among their units." Jung would see this phenomenon as an adaptive regression to more primitive and instinctive forms of communication under extreme pressure. An example of how the psyche, when its civilized mechanisms fail, resorts to older, more fundamental strategies. Medical reports from this period document another peculiar phenomenon: the significant increase in what was called selective auditory fatigue among tank crews. Doctors described cases where veterans of Firefly encounters developed an apparent inability to hear certain specific sounds, particularly those similar to the distant firing of the 17-pounder gun. Dr. Werner Schmidt wrote, "Several patients demonstrate a peculiar and specific deafness. They react normally to most sounds, but seem unable to consciously register sounds resembling the firing of the British 17-pounder. When these sounds are produced experimentally, patients show no conscious response, but their bodies react: dilated pupils, increased heart rate, sweating."
This phenomenon perfectly illustrates the Jungian concept of psychic dissociation, the psyche's ability to separate unbearable content from consciousness, relegating it exclusively to the physiological or unconscious realm. The sound of the Firefly's gun had become literally inaudible consciously, although the body continued to register and respond to it. Compared to other technological novelties of World War II, the Sherman Firefly was not particularly revolutionary. It was essentially a standard Sherman tank equipped with a more powerful gun. However, its psychological impact was disproportionate to this modest technical innovation. This disparity perfectly illustrates the Jungian principle that it is not objective reality that determines psychic impact, but the moment and symbolic context in which this reality emerges. Military analyst Walter Schelling observed in a post-war study, the Sherman Firefly was not technically superior to the best German tanks in general terms. The Tiger and Panther still had significant advantages in armor and, in the case of the Tiger, in firepower. What made the Firefly a psychologically devastating weapon was the fact that it specifically denied the one advantage German crews believed to be inviolable: their invulnerability at range. This point is crucial for a Jungian understanding of the phenomenon. The Firefly was not an objectively superior tank. It was a tank that attacked precisely the most psychologically sensitive point of German armored identity. It is the psychological equivalent of Achilles being struck in his only vulnerable spot, the heel. As the Allies advanced through northwestern Europe in late 1944 and early 1945, German tank tactics changed dramatically. They increasingly abandoned direct engagements, preferring ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. Field reports describe panzer units refusing to engage enemy formations unless they were absolutely certain there were no Fireflies present. An officer of the 9th Panzer Division described, "Our tactics are now dictated not by what we can do, but by what we must avoid. Our men consider any Sherman a potential Firefly until proven otherwise. This means we often avoid engagements where we would have a numerical advantage just for the possibility that 1 or 2 Fireflies might be present." Jung would see this as a classic manifestation of phobic behavior. The psychological response to an object of terror is not proportional to the real threat, but to the perceived or symbolic threat. Combat statistics indicated that even after the Firefly's introduction, German tanks still destroyed more Shermans than they lost their own tanks. But this statistical reality was irrelevant to the traumatized psyche of German crews. Share this video with anyone you know who's interested in psychology or military history. A fascinating aspect of this period was the change in the visual representation of tanks in German military publications. Analyses of training materials, bulletins, and official illustrations reveal a subtle but significant transformation. Before the Firefly's introduction, Allied tanks were often depicted on a smaller scale than German tanks, or in obviously disadvantageous positions. After mid-1944, these representations became more realistic in terms of scale, and, notably, Shermans began to be drawn with ambiguously long barrels, as if the illustrators were reluctant to clearly distinguish between common Shermans and Fireflies. A military historian observed, "It's almost as if German military publications were avoiding drawing attention to the Firefly's longer gun, as if the mere visual representation could have a demoralizing effect." Jung would interpret this representational change as an example of symbolic avoidance, when the collective psyche avoids explicit representations of traumatic content, even in contexts where such specificity would be logically necessary. Allied intelligence reports noted another intriguing behavioral change. German crews began to camouflage their own tanks in increasingly elaborate ways, often focusing specifically on altering the distinctive profile of the turret and gun. Some even built false structures that made Panthers look like non-combat support vehicles when viewed from a distance. A British aerial reconnaissance report from December 1944 observed, "The Germans are investing extraordinary efforts in camouflaging their main battle tanks. Notably, the modifications seem designed not only to hide the tank, but specifically to obscure the exact type of tank, as if the mere recognition of being a Tiger or Panther could attract unwanted attention." This tactic reveals a fascinating reversal in combat psychology. Traditionally, German tanks like the Tiger inspired fear and were often used for their psychological effect as much as for their actual firepower. Now, paradoxically,
German crews wanted to hide not only the presence of their tanks, but their specific identity, fearing that Tigers and Panthers would be prioritized as targets by Firefly gunners. In Jungian terms, this represents a complete reversal of the previous psychic inflation. The excessive pride in technological identity had transformed into its opposite, a desire for technological anonymity. The tank, once a symbol of power to be displayed, had become a stigma to be concealed. In the final weeks of the war, a final and deeply symbolic phenomenon was documented: a significant increase in the personalization of German tanks. Crews began to paint names, personal symbols, and even elaborate artworks on their vehicles, a practice previously more common among American and British tankers than Germans. An Allied intelligence officer observed, "German tanks captured in the final phases of the war often show surprising levels of personalization. Names, symbols, sometimes philosophical or religious quotes painted on turrets and hulls. It's as if, confronted with the inevitability of defeat, the crews were seeking to impose some personal meaning on their probable destruction." Jung would interpret this trend as a final attempt at individuation in the face of annihilation. When the collective persona, in this case the German military identity, collapses, a compensatory impulse arises to assert individual identity. The personal names and symbols represent an attempt to say, even if the we is doomed, the I still matters.
In the final moments of the war, the psychological impact of the Sherman Firefly had transcended its immediate military role to become part of a broader, lasting legacy in the psyche of German veterans. Interviews conducted with former tank crews years after the conflict reveal how the specific trauma associated with these tanks uniquely persisted in collective memory. A study conducted by the Hamburg Institute of Military Psychology in 1957 interviewed 104 former tank crews who had faced the Firefly. Notably, 72% reported recurring dreams involving these tanks even 12 years after the war ended. In comparison, only 31% reported similar dreams about air attacks, which statistically caused more casualties among German armored forces. Dr. Klaus Hoffmann, who conducted the study, observed, "The psychological impact of the Firefly demonstrates a distinct archetypal quality. It was not just the physical threat that created the lasting trauma, but the symbolic meaning. The moment of recognition that technological superiority, a fundamental pillar of German military identity, had been neutralized." This observation is perfectly aligned with the Jungian understanding of psychic trauma. For Jung, the most traumatic events are not necessarily the most violent or objectively dangerous, but those that fundamentally challenge our deepest psychic structures, the narratives and symbols through which we understand our identity and place in the world. Historically, Firefly tanks were responsible for approximately 7% of the total German tanks destroyed on the Western Front. However, in personal narratives, memoirs, and post-war interviews, they feature in almost 28% of descriptions of traumatic combat, a statistical disparity that reveals their disproportionate psychological impact. A particularly revealing phenomenon was documented in a 1962 study on the post-war adjustment of German veterans. Researchers noted that former tank crews who had survived encounters with Firefly demonstrated a statistically significant tendency to choose professions that involved protective structures, becoming crane operators, heavy truck drivers, or working in highly structured environments like mines or factories with heavy machinery. Sociologist Wilhelm Strauss, analyzing this pattern, wrote, "There appears to be an unconscious attempt to recreate the tank environment, but with a crucial difference. This time, the individual maintains control over their protection and mobility, a psychological compensation for the helplessness experienced when their invulnerable tanks proved vulnerable." Jung would describe this as an attempt to master trauma through controlled repetition, an unconscious process where the psyche seeks to recreate aspects of the traumatic event, but with modifications that allow for a renewed sense of agency and control. Curiously, post-war industrial records in West Germany show that several significant innovations in industrial safety systems were developed by engineers who had served in panzer units. A notable example was the development of the first automated fire detection and suppression systems for heavy industrial machinery, technology directly inspired by the trauma of burning tanks. An engineer, formerly a Panther commander, explained in a technical interview, "I never forgot the terror of being in a hit tank with the fuel and ammunition about to explode. I developed this system so that no heavy machinery operator has to face that moment of helplessness when they realize they are trapped in a structure about to become their coffin." This transformation of personal trauma into beneficial innovation represents what Jung would call the alchemical transmutation of suffering, when psychically devastating experiences are eventually metabolized into constructive creation, a fundamental aspect of the true individuation process. In post-war German popular culture, Tiger and Panther tanks were often mythologized, appearing in films, books, and later games as symbols of German technological excellence, separated from their broader Nazi context. Notably, in these representations, the Sherman Firefly often appears as the archetypal nemesis, the necessary antagonist that gives meaning to the narrative of the tragic hero. A cultural critic observed in a 1960s analysis of German war films, there is almost a psychological need in these narratives to include the moment of recognition, when the German protagonist realizes that his tank, once invulnerable, can be destroyed. It's as if this moment of vulnerability humanizes the character, allowing the post-war German audience to identify with defeat without completely losing technological pride. This observation perfectly reflects the Jungian understanding of how myths and cultural narratives often process collective traumas, transforming them into structures of meaning that can be integrated into post-traumatic identity. In veterans' testimonies and memoirs, a recurring theme is how the encounter with the Firefly transformed not only their war experience but their fundamental worldview. Many describe a specific moment of awakening, the sudden understanding that the narrative of German superiority they had absorbed through propaganda was fundamentally false. A former tank commander wrote in his memoirs published in 1978, "When I saw our third Tiger destroyed by a long-barreled Sherman, something permanently changed in my worldview. If this machine, which represented the pinnacle of German engineering, could be so easily destroyed, what other certainties in my life were also illusions?" This doubt stayed with me long after the war ended, affecting my political, personal, and professional choices in the decades that followed.
This reflection illustrates what Jung would call the death of the inner God, the traumatic but potentially liberating collapse of an identification with a system of values or beliefs that proves false. It is often the painful beginning of a more authentic individuation process. In global statistical terms, the material impact of the Sherman Firefly in World War II was significant but not decisive in isolation. Approximately 2,100 units were produced, representing about 5% of the total Sherman tanks available to Allied forces. German documents estimate that they were responsible for the destruction of approximately 800 to 900 German tanks, mainly Panzer IVs, but also dozens of Tigers and Panthers, the supposedly invincible of the German armored force. However, their psychological impact was incalculably greater than these statistics suggest. As military historian Sir Basil Liddell Hart observed, the Firefly created an impact on the morale of the German armored forces completely disproportionate to its number or even its actual capabilities. It represented the moment when the myth of German technological invulnerability was irrevocably broken. If this video helped deepen your understanding of the psychological impact of war, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our future content on Jungian psychology applied to historical events. A final and deeply Jungian aspect of this historical phenomenon was the transformation of the Firefly symbolism in the psyche of German veterans over the decades. In immediate post-war interviews, the term Firefly or Glühwürmchen almost always evoked negative associations: fear, vulnerability, death. However, in interviews conducted in the 1970s and 80s with the same veterans, researchers noted a subtle but significant transformation. Many former tank crews had begun to associate the Firefly with concepts such as revelation, illumination, or even awakening. A veteran interviewed in 1982 reflected, "The Firefly showed us the truth about our situation, a painful truth, yes, but necessary. As we say in German, Wahrheit macht frei. Truth sets you free. Perhaps we needed that penetrating light to show us that we were fighting for a doomed cause, serving a regime that did not deserve our loyalty." Jung would see this symbolic transformation as the final and most complete aspect of the psychic integration of a collective trauma, when the traumatic symbol is not only consciously accepted, but reinterpreted as a bearer of deeper meaning and purpose. It is the true alchemical transmutation of raw experience into lasting wisdom. The psychological legacy of the encounters between German troops and the Sherman Firefly remains a fascinating case study of how technological and military events can have impacts that completely transcend their immediate tactical significance.
The shock of sudden vulnerability, the dissolution of a myth of superiority, the need to quickly adapt to a new threatening reality, all these aspects remain relevant to our modern understanding of collective traumas and the psychology of conflict. As Carl Jung wrote in Aspects of the Contemporary Drama, the encounter with the other, with the unknown that challenges our deepest certainties, is always an opportunity for the growth of consciousness, even when this encounter is initially experienced as traumatic or devastating. The Sherman Firefly tanks, with their 17-pounder guns capable of penetrating the most powerful German armor, were literally and figuratively a penetrating force, piercing not only steel, but layers of psychological illusion, ideological propaganda, and archetypal identification that had protected the German psyche as effectively as physical armor protected their bodies. The ultimate legacy of this psychological phenomenon transcends the specific context of World War II. It offers us a vivid case study of how the human psyche, individual and collective, responds when its fundamental structures of meaning are suddenly challenged or destroyed. As such, it remains relevant to our contemporary understanding of collective traumas, whether caused by conflicts, natural disasters, economic collapses, or technological revolutions. The encounter between German troops and the Sherman Firefly reminds us that, as Jung constantly emphasized, we are fundamentally symbolic beings. We respond not just to material reality, but to the meaning we attribute to that reality. And when that meaning is traumatically transformed, we are transformed with it. Sometimes destroyed, sometimes reborn, but always, inevitably, altered by the penetrating power of revealing light.